Here's something to inspire your morning. Christianity has a marriage problem. Inspired, yes. What we do know is divorce rates among Christians tend to be very similar to everyone else. About a quarter to a third of marriages, based on what stats you look at, tend to move that direction, unfortunately. In fact, I know that if I surveyed the room, I would guess that each one of us has either a direct or an indirect connection and have been in some way, shape, or form affected by divorce. You know, some of this for some of us is very painful and fresh and hurts, and we're going to hold that together today. You know, beyond divorce, of course, we have unhealthy marriages that are also hard. Marriage is just a hard thing to do, right? And so when there's unhealthy marriages, if there's kids in the mix, of course, that just means a lot for the kids to have to battle through as they get older. Marriages often struggle with communication. They lack vulnerability at times. Sometimes, you know, I think we all would hope that if we are people who get married at some point, we kind of hope, like, yeah, I hope my spouse would be the kind of person that I would be best friends with or the closest to. And we just know that's not always functionally true. There's a lack of maturity often we bring to marriage, a lack of self-awareness. And really, some of us, especially if we grew up in church, probably bring into a marriage a big sense of idealism. Sort of this idea that I'm going to do all the right things because I've been taught to do the right things, so the right things should be the easy things to do, but they're not always, right? They're not always easy. There's people who, because of religious and social pressures, will stay in abusive marriages, which, by the way, we're going to talk about that a little bit. I'm just going to put my cards on the table. An abusive marriage, the vows have been broken, walk away and talk to someone about it, please. Can I be that blunt? If you are being physically harmed today, go find someone, talk about it. Some of you know my story. I just have to be that blunt about it. You see, here's the deal. When Jesus isn't at the center of a marriage, it's hard to want to really do all that Jesus asks us to in all kinds of relationships. And that sort of posture that Jesus has is, what does it look like to serve another human? What does it look like to be a self-offering person who offers love to the other, who offers emotional security, physical security, true, deep, passionate love? And of course, we also know that sometimes relationships end or are plagued by choices of emotional or physical adultery. So we know that it's not going to be easy, and living up to the Jesus ideal seems hard. And yet, if we look at the Bible, this idea of marriage, it's supposed to be one way that God invites us to partner with others in imaging God's love to the world. And you know what? We all want to have healthy relationships. I don't think I've met anyone who's like, man, I would love to have more bad relationships, you know? Like, I'd like to have another person at work that just bothers me all the time. I want to have another member of my family who I don't get along. You know, no one thinks like that. We want healthy relationships. And not everyone in this room is married. Not everyone in this room might even want to be married. And so there's a variety of things we bring. And so if that's you, if you're not married or not sure if you want to be married or just in a space where you're waiting to see how that all shakes out, what I hope you find today as we look at this idea of marriage and divorce and remarriage and some of these themes is that really commitments to any relationship are really central. That the commitments we make to other people are so central that I would say they're a key ingredient to healthy friendships, family relationships, spouses, and etc. And so today's big idea that I hope we can kind of take with us is this: honoring our shared commitments cultivates healthy relationships. And you can apply that anywhere in your relational mix. It definitely applies to marriage. That's what we're going to be looking at. But wherever you might be in your journey at this point, we know that God created us for wholeness and relational harmony, and shalom is a word we'll toss around here, right? That these ideas of shared commitments that we make to each other, shared values, we decide, hey, we're going to relate to one another in a particular way, or shared convictions, if it's a romantic relationship, promises or vows we make to each other. So shared commitments where we say we have a shared understanding of what it means to be in relationship to each other. We know the boundaries of what that looks like. We know the expectations of what that looks like, whether it's your buddy or your spouse. This is so important. And this is one of the ways Jesus shows us how to thrive. And so today, we're going to continue our series, Summer on the Mount. And if you've been here for the last couple of messages, this is part 3 of a summer series where we're walking through the Sermon on the Mount. And what we're going to do today, we're really going to have to dive deep into the world of Jesus to understand some really hard words of Jesus. And so part of what we'll do today is really try and understand some really important and hard things that Jesus says about relationships and keeping our word and all of that. And then we're going to ask some questions about, so how does this apply to me now? So we're going to go to the nerdy part for a big chunk, and then we're going to try and land the plane together and say, how does this shake out? Is that all right? Yeah, are we ready? Okay, so here's a little spoiler, that's the wrong thing. I like to name my sources sometimes. Today, I'm very dependent on the work of David Instone Brewer. The Divorce and Remarriage in the Church is a book that I highly recommend. The other one is a bit technical, but I just want to say I'm indebted to this gentleman's work here, and I didn't just go write a research paper this week and come up with all of this. There's some long discussion about the stuff we'll be looking at. So, today we jump to Matthew chapter 5, and we'll be in verse 27 and following, and here's what it says. It'll be on the screen. It says, "You have heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you that every man who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. And if your right eye causes you to fall into sin, tear it out, throw it away. It's better that you lose a part of your body than the whole body be thrown into hell." How's that for an encouraging morning? Yeah. Now, I want to pause here. It's really important you understand something. Jesus is trying to make a very important point. He's saying, look, what happens internally, we've been talking about this, your internal posture towards God and towards reality shapes the kind of person you act like in the world. And so Jesus is trying to make a very strong point here. It's like, look, if your right hand causes you to sin, just chop it off. Do you think Jesus was walking around with a machete chopping hands off? No. Jewish teachers have a very important word in their vocabulary. It's hyperbole. Hyperbole. It's intended exaggeration to make a point, right? No one would say, oh, yeah, Jesus is into tearing out eyes and cutting off hands. This is not the way of Jesus. But he's trying to say, like, this is a big deal, and it starts inside of you. It starts with your God awareness and self-awareness coming together in a healthy place. We're going to keep going. So now, verse 30. "And if your right hand causes you to fall into sin, chop it off." Yep, there it is, right? "Chop it off and throw it away. It's better that you lose a part of your body than your whole body go into hell." Verse 31. "It was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a divorce certificate. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for sexual unfaithfulness forces her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." The church has historically taken a few different positions on this particular passage, because on a surface sort of reading, it seems like what Jesus is saying, look, Divorce is only possible if the other person has acted out in a particular way with another human. And he is simply saying that, that's for sure. But it's a little more complex than that. And I want us to step into the complexity this morning because I've known too many people for whom this passage and the interpretation of this passage and its parallels throughout the Gospels has led to, hey, my spouse didn't actually physically cheat, so I'm trapped even though there's violence at home, even though there's A, B, or C that's absolutely immoral at home, and it doesn't seem to be stopping. But how do we do that? Well, the first little bit is there's a little hyperbole probably in Jesus' tone. He just said, your right hand causes you to sin, what do? You chop it off, right? There's also a sense of like, hey, like when you divorce someone in Jesus' world, and it's not for a valid cause, you're basically forcing that person to go and commit adultery. There's a little bit of punch to that. It's not just a flat reading, but I'm going to give you more to kind of build that kind of up in our minds. So let's get a little nerdy. Here we go. This next image is a picture of a divorce certificate. It's from the 2nd century. We have 2 surviving divorce certificates. One in the 2nd century, so the century right after Jesus, and then we have one from the 1st century. What's fascinating about this particular one is that it was written by a woman, which we thought was definitely rare, and it's a woman who is actually taking the initiative to divorce the husband for a variety of reasons. Now, it got to a point where most situations in the 1st century world of Judaism especially, where if a woman would accuse a husband of being unfaithful in any ways pertaining to what counted as a valid ground for divorce, she had to depend on her husband's willingness to write that divorce certificate. This is the exception, not the rule. And so the rabbis, the teachers of the time, eventually start to say, yeah, it's still really important that the husband probably be the one who writes it in this setting. But they kind of started finding loopholes to make this happen. And I thought this was hilarious and weird, and I don't know what to do with it. But the rabbis actually started to teach, like, hey, if he's unwilling and we've judged that it's wrong, that he's broken his marriage vows in some way and still won't actually write his divorce certificate, then what we'll do is we'll beat him with sticks until he submits to it. It's like, don't know if I like that. But that's kind of like so even in the early days, they're trying to say, we've got to make sure we're protecting women in this environment. And so what you would do is if you were the victim, whether you're a man or a woman, you would actually go to a Torah expert who also functioned as an attorney and a judge, and they would make a ruling, and if the kind of situation seemed to be so-and-so has broken a vow, therefore the victim in this situation is now free to leave. And they're not only free to leave, but they may remarry whoever they wish. And this was common jargon on these documents. I'm going to come back to this, but we need to read just a little bit more, okay? So, Jesus continues. He talks about divorce. He talks about sort of adultery of the heart. And now we're going to be in verse 33 of our passage. And he's going to keep talking about keeping our commitments and our integrity intact. He says, again, you've heard it said that those who lived long ago, don't make a false solemn pledge, but you should follow through on what you have pledged to the Lord. But I say to you that you must not pledge at all. You must not pledge by heaven because it's God's throne. You must not pledge, and by the way, another word would be swear. Pledge by the earth because it's God's footstool. You must not pledge by Jerusalem because it's the city of the great king. And you must not pledge by your head because you can't turn one hair white or black. Let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. This whole section that we're reading right now is all about how are you going to keep your commitments intact? How are you going to be the kind of person who, when you say yes to something, it means yes to the thing? When you say no to something, it actually means no to the thing. And so Jesus really pushes us to have integrity in how we engage with others. So again, back to our main idea, honoring shared commitments cultivates healthy relationships. And this is what Jesus seems to be saying here. Jesus says that we should keep our word in all situations. That we should be the kind of people who keep our word in all situations. This definitely includes marriage contracts. And like we would have standard vows in these contracts. They would have standard grounds for divorce, like what is divorceable in those contracts for Jewish people. And the standard, like we said, sort of release from the contract. So I want to explore this a bit because I think it's really important that we just sort of understand so we can come back to some of these words of Jesus and read them with their whole sort of story intact. You ready to do this? Got a little Old Testament for you. Here we go. This is Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11. It says, if he, the husband, if he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is free to go without any payment of money. So this is a verse about a situation, and remember, polygamy technically was allowed for a season in the life of Judaism. It eventually sort of fades out, and there's reasons for that, obviously. But during this period, this is a man who is married, falls in love with his servant or slave, and says, hey, let's get married, right? There's multiple marriages happening here. But this slave, if she is found to have a situation where her husband now is going to have another wife, Moses wrote, hey, food, clothing, and marital rights is what she deserves. So the rabbis, as they are sort of teaching and wrestling with how do we interpret Scripture in the days leading up to the time of Jesus, basically reason that, hey, if these rights are available to a slave, which is like the bottom of the stratosphere socially, then it's the bare minimum and it extends to everyone else. And so these become the grounds for divorce. And in fact, marriage contracts would often cite this passage. When you would become married, this was the verse that people would write down on the contract. David Instone Brewer puts it this way, just to give us a little context. Here's a quote. He says, the rabbis found the following principles in this text. They reasoned that if a slave wife had the right to divorce a husband who neglected to supply food, clothing, and conjugal love, then a free wife would certainly also have this right. And they argued that if one of the two wives had this right, so did an only wife. Furthermore, if a wife had these rights, then a husband was also entitled to divorce a wife who neglected them. For, the biblical principle that is established, therefore, is the right of someone to divorce their partner if they neglect their vow to provide food, clothing, and conjugal love. And that phrase, conjugal love, is very hard to translate from Hebrew because it's like the only time it's ever really used, I understand. And so it's this idea of physical but beyond physical love to your spouse. Okay, we tracking so far? So for ancient Judaism, we have three areas already where they would say you could possibly divorce a spouse. Neglecting food, neglecting clothing, neglecting love. Deuteronomy 24, let's keep going. So this was the other big marriage contract passage especially in the days that led up to Jesus being born. It says this: if a man marries a woman and she does not please him because he has found something indecent in her, or literally a cause of indecency, then he may draw up a divorce document, give it to her, and evict her from his house. Okay, so we really got to break this down, and I have some visuals that I think are going to help us do this. So the Hebrew word, there's two words here in that phrase that's kind of highlighted. There's a word erwat, which is this idea of indecency. Another word that's really hard to translate. It might be about adultery, might not. It's kind of a generic catch-all term. And then there's dabar. Dabar in Hebrew is simply a word that's like a thing, a matter, a cause. It's sort of like a catch-all term for generic nouns, right? And so what ended up happening is there was a great debate about what does a cause of indecency mean? What do these two words mean in this passage? Because this is a fourth ground for divorce, apparently. So the next slide is going to show you how this works out. A cause of indecency, right, is adultery. By the time of Jesus, all the Pharisees, which was the biggest sort of Jewish group of the time, they all agreed on this. That word was about adultery. So it's an indecent sort of situation. But here's where it gets really confusing, is that there are some teachers who disagree on the word cause, matter, thing. The next slide is going to show us just a little bit, right? So a view that comes out, there's two sort of views of two major schools, and we're going to break this down for a quick minute, is adultery, everyone agreed. By the way, everyone agreed on those other causes of divorce. But this teacher Hillel, who was just a popular teacher right before Jesus, saw like, hey, there's a word about a cause and there's a word about adultery. So adultery is a big deal, but it's actually a cause like any cause. So they would separate the clause into two different items, right? And so what ends up happening in the time of Jesus is this idea of an any cause divorce. You following? So, and it was always a man. So a man could simply say something about the nature of his wife and say, well, she didn't commit adultery. The other things are being taken care of, but it's any cause. So if I don't like her, it's any cause, right? You can imagine how this goes. I think there's people in the modern world that probably love this philosophy. Like, divorce ain't a big deal. Well, continuing on here, because they weren't the only ones who wrestled with this. Of course, Shammai would be the more restrictive rabbi. So here's what it says about these two rabbis that are creating schools around the time of Jesus. The school of Shammai says a man should not divorce his wife except for indecency found in her, since it says, for he found in her an indecency cause, right? And the school of Hillel says, even if she spoiled his dish, it says any cause, right? So there's other phrases about like, hey, if you burn the toast, if your wife burns the bread, it's any cause, divorce her. I have a wife. I've had leftovers that are so good waiting for me in the fridge. And I've come home and I've been on my way to the fridge to look for them. And that charming, beautiful face with the biggest, cheesiest grin looks at me and goes, Curtis, thank you for your leftovers, you know. That's any cause, right? You know what I mean? Like that. Luckily, I'm a Jesus follower, not a Hillel follower, right? But like, gosh. So it's one of those things, right? Shammai's like, hey, like it's a cause of indecency. Come on, just put the grammar together. But Hillel, and so the view of Hillel, this any cause divorce becomes the popular view in first century Judaism. And so to summarize, like there's four causes that everyone agrees on, and I'm going to put them on the screen. I think, yeah, there they are. right? A cause of indecency. Everyone agrees at least that indecency is about, sexual impropriety and neglecting to provide food or clothing or love. These are all things that every rabbi, every Jewish teacher agreed on, except is it any cause or is it a cause of indecency? And Jesus is going to step into that world. And of course, by extension, anything worse, right? Like if this is the bare minimum again, the rabbis would say, yeah, abuse or forced relations, abandonment. The Apostle Paul will actually say, hey, if you've been abandoned by your husband, you're free in the Lord, right? To a spouse in 1 Corinthians. So there's a real sort of sense of what Jesus is walking into. And so we have the backstory, and we're going to read an extended version of Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage, and we're going to try and tie this together in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Are you ready to do this? Okay, so that's the backstory. Jesus walks into a situation, and this is what it says. Then some Pharisees came to him in order to test him. They asked, is it lawful to divorce a wife for any cause? Okay, if you're walking around one day and, someone comes to you and they're like, hey, is it legal for Billy, the 18-year-old, to drink? What are you going to fill in your head? You're going to be saying, oh, we're talking about alcoholic beverages, right? You're probably not talking about, is it legal for Billy to drink water so he doesn't die? Yeah? Right? Like everything has a context. Everything has sort of like a world in which it's said. The Gospels are historical documents documenting something that the people who wrote them would have intuitive knowledge that you and I just aren't privy to 2,000 years later unless we make some good historical discoveries. That's actually just the truth. And so when any cause is said here, it's not just like random use of grammar. This is very, very intentional. And basically what we need to have in mind is what Jesus would have in mind is, we're about to enter a debate about Deuteronomy 24:1. We're now going to have to deal with all of the rabbi stuff. And so Jesus answered, have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and will be united with his wife and the two will become one flesh. Side note, the Hebrew version of that verse doesn't actually have the word two. Some people started using the word two as a subversive way of saying two means two, not a few, right? And so in Judaism at the time of Jesus is siding with those who would say polygamy is outside of God's design. I'm going to keep going. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her? Jesus said to them, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of your hard hearts. But from the beginning, it was not this way. Now I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another commits adultery. Jesus, with that one verse in mind, says, it's not any cause, it's except for immorality, adultery, etc. And so Jesus is going to say, like, hey, God's ideal, lifelong, committed, two people loving each other, husband and wife, following the ways of imaging God to the world. That is the ideal. But if you're asking Jesus about Deuteronomy, he's going to say, yeah, you want to know where I stand on the debate? Jesus essentially says, I'm with Shammai. I agree with Shammai. I agree that the phrase is just about a cause, a matter, a situation of indecency or immorality or adultery. And he sides on the debate very clearly. I want to show you contrasting views really quick here. This is going to be super helpful, I think. By the way, that photograph of Shammai and Hillel survived the last 2,000 years, so you're welcome. So Shammai, where do they land on this debate? Well, the main focus for the two popular rabbis of the day is let's parse out this verse. Jesus is like, I'll speak to that, but really we should go back to the beginning. It's all about God's design for people in relationship. So cause of indecency, of course, you can see the various sorts of ideas there. And notice that Shammai and Hillel both would say, if this happens, you're bound to divorce the offending party. Jesus is more about permission than requirement. Jesus says, fight like crazy for your relationships. Fight like crazy to be in relationship. Whether it's a married relationship or any other relationship, fight for it. And here, Jesus says it's not required, it's allowable. And so, where did they actually have universal agreement? Clearly, it's on the other verse, Exodus 21, 1 through 11. No teacher of the time denied any of those grounds for divorce. They all would have said, these areas matter. These areas matter. So if we keep going, if we have this idea that honoring shared commitments cultivates healthy relationships, the first thing I want to just say, as we sort this out together, is Jesus calls married couples to fight for love. Jesus calls married couples to fight for love. And that might include, by the way, some good arguments between you and your spouse. But it means saying, I'm going to do whatever it takes to say that I have made a vow before God and before people, and I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to be invested in it. The hard thing is that it's not always both parties that have that same posture, is it? It's not always both parties that are committed to fighting for love. But let me tell you, whatever it is that you have to do to help make space for a mutual kind of struggle for love, please don't wait. Please don't let your marriage get to the point where you have nothing left to stand on, but maybe, your reputation in front of other people, or some religious obligations. Do not let it get to that point. Jesus is like, look, go back to the beginning. It's all about men and women loving each other well, and by extension, humans loving each other well. Jesus says you have permission to divorce in certain situations, and you should take that permission, I would say, when necessary. But fight for love. The next thing is that Jesus knew that sometimes divorce would be unavoidable, especially for victims. If someone in the first century found themselves without the food they needed, either to receive the food or to prepare the food in that culture, same with the clothing, same with love. In fact, the rabbis had various passages where they would talk about how often, depending on your career, how often there should be love happening, right? So certain careers, it was at least once a month, at least twice a week. Anyway, it's very weird. But this is how they sort of talked about this stuff. But Jesus knew, hey, there are situations where love is, just not there. Divorce might be unavoidable. And what do we do with that? He talks about how people can be hard-hearted. And you know what? I can be hard-hearted, right? Sometimes we have to admit that we're part of the problem. And maybe we don't have to get to this point in our marriage relationships or our friendships, right? How many times do we hear about deep friendships that just divorce, right? How many times did God have to walk through a divorce? In the Garden of Eden, there's sort of a divorcing that happens, and yet God pursues the relationship beyond it. Towards the end of the Old Testament, God says Israel has divorced him. And yet God continues to pursue the relationship. But there are situations where it might just be sadly what it is. Third thought, Jesus teaches that remarriage is an option, especially when a divorce was on valid grounds. Here's a couple of thoughts. We can't over-literalize and get super rigid about these 4 grounds of divorce in the Bible. We need to be wise and discerning. We have the Spirit, so we live in the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, if you understand what that language is about. But here's the deal. I've known Christians who perpetually felt like they were sinning because they had a second marriage. That's a lie. That is an absolute lie. God's grace is bigger than the hardest things you've walked through. Jesus says sometimes it doesn't work. Be free. Now, here's the biggest challenge. I want to lean into this idea of valid divorce. Our day, we just are like, hey, divorce is a convenience, right? Like I've got stuff and I don't like the person anymore. I've fallen out of love. I've heard of stories where one spouse is like, I never sowed my wild oats and now I'm ready, right? I hate that metaphor. Mostly because Pastor Jody just gave me a funny face. I was like, oh yeah, maybe it's a weird one. But these things come up and it's like, that's not what Jesus is getting at. Because remember, Jesus says, fight for your relationships. Fight to make them work. Fight to grow. Fight to mature. So sometimes it's like, you know what? We need to just grow up, and we need to be people who can grow into the people Jesus sees us as possibly becoming. So we don't use Jesus' exceptions as an excuse to just not try. But there are situations where things might not be salvageable. And I want you to know that I think that Jesus would say, go in peace if you've tried everything possible to rectify the situation. So, what do we do depending on our life stage? Let me give you a few quick thoughts and we're going to wrap up. If you're single, and this is so minimalistic, and so I'm sorry, I just want to just name the fact that we're having a conversation about marriage and divorce, and not everyone is married or wants to be or will be, so I just want to name that and know that wherever you are in your relational journey, you're seen and you're loved and you matter, and God doesn't base your value on the kinds of relationships you've had or haven't had based on societal standards. You are loved. And you matter here at Brentview, you matter to Jesus. And we also look at Jesus as a model and say, hey, he was single. Interesting, right? If you're married, follow Jesus by loving your spouse well. If you're divorced, don't let shame be the thing that defines who you are. And get remarried, yeah, if, and I think it's a big if, you're able to say our shared commitments to Jesus are going to define the way we love each other. Then maybe there's redemption on the other side. Because as we've said, honoring shared commitments cultivates healthy relationships. So I'm going to close with a bit of my story. I've shared in various contexts before that there was a season in Seattle where Lauren and I hit the 10-year mark of marriage, and things just got challenging. We couldn't really figure it out. We couldn't name it. And we finally had to come to a decision after much just challenge and stress and frustration. We had to come to a decision. Do we want to be a couple who becomes roommates for the rest of our lives, or do we want to be a married couple? Therapy, mentors, friends, a lot of Jesus. A lot of time, a lot of hard conversations, a lot of tears, a lot of stress, a lot of what ifs, a lot of I don't knows. And Jesus did something special. I'd say we're more in love now. I would say God gifted us with more togetherness, and it's incredible. But here's the deal. It's not about bragging or talking about here, we're the success story. We'll probably, at the 20-year mark, have to do some more work, right? Because this thing is just ongoing. You're going to always have work to do. You're going to always have things that come up. And I realize that not every marriage is salvageable. Not every marriage is going to sort of have the capacity to survive every challenge. But by God's grace, we ought to strive for that because that's God's will for your life if you're married. That's God's will for your life in relationships if you're single or not, right? Like, this is God's will, that you would be together with people who share your values, who share your vision for life, and who represent God well to a world that is broken and committed often to not keeping commitments. So may we be people who are known for honoring our shared commitments. May we also be people who are known for being humble, non-judgmental, aware that marriage and things are hard and complex, and open to the possibility that Jesus isn't done with us yet, even when things go terribly wrong. And may we be known as people who keep our commitments to one another, who love one another as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. Let's pray together. And so, Jesus, thank you for your goodness, your love, your grace. We know that this thing called relationship is hard. We know that life is hard. If there's anyone here today, God, who's walking through a lot of stress at home, would you give them grace to notice your love? Would you open them up to the areas that maybe they're unaware of, some blind spots? Would you give them wisdom about how to move forward? If there are things that are way outside the boundaries of what a marriage should be, would you give them courage to seek help? And for all of us, would you help us to become more like you by being the kind of people who stick to what we say, who keep our vows, who keep our commitments, who seek to do the work necessary to be lifelong learners of your way of life. So Jesus, we give you this time as we close with a couple of songs to worship you. In your name we pray. Amen.